Welcome to Bellman Woodworking and Designs with me, Brent Bellman. And today we're going to look at how to make one of these, a cutting board with inlay. This cutting board was inspired by David Picciuto of Makesomething TV. This cutting board shows inlay made from walnut, and the rest of the cutting board is made from maple. Alright, the first step in this project was to cut all the pieces to rough length, and the wood I used for this again was maple and walnut, and that just I thought would give a good contrast in color. So after cutting everything to length, I did run them over to the planer to get all the edges nice and square so these could meet up really well once I had them all clamped down. So once I had the pieces cut, I did glue them all up, and I bought these clamps from Harbor Freight and they did a great job. They're not the really expensive ones, but they work well. Now the biggest thing I would say when you're clamping these up like this is to make sure the boards are as even as possible, and David Picciuto did recommend that in his video because it will make for a lot less sanding or planing once you have everything put together inside the clamps. Alright, once I had all that done, I got ready to make the jig, and I just used some particle board that I had lying around. And I did what David did, which was to put some screws in a board and then put one of the strips I'd cut from the maple and use that to draw a line. But something I would recommend is to not do what I did here. And I used a shorter piece and then kind of tried to freehand where the lines would be. But I would make sure you have a strip that's cut the full length that you need. So after doing that, you can get your lines drawn on the board. Once you have your lines where you want, then I went back with a router, and this was an 1/8 inch router, and I used that to cut the groove. So once I had that groove cut, I took it to the bandsaw and cut the two pieces apart, making sure to stay in the line as close as I could, because then when you're done, you go back and use a router with a flush trim bit to clean up all the edges. And I did clean up everything. It doesn't look perfect in that shot, but you can tell I did clean it up later on. So after that, I went and cut my strips from another piece of maple and from the walnut. And those would be the strips that are actually the inlay that goes in the cutting board. And I just cut them as close to the same size as each one would be. I just used my eye to look at it. David had a actual device he used to make sure he had them all the same width, but you can tell in that shot, I think I did a pretty good job getting them all to the right size. So once they were here, again, you have to glue everything up and get everything put in the clamps. And this is a little bit difficult. This step is not as crucial to get everything perfectly lined up. But when you go to do your second or third inlay, you'll want to make sure they're lined up. Otherwise, the lines do get off and it doesn't look as good in my opinion. So you definitely have to glue the heck out of everything and put it in the clamps and get it clamped down, which is a little bit difficult because when you're trying to press all this wood into shape, it definitely wants to spring back on you. So make sure everything is glued up, get it set in there, and get your clamps finger tied as best you can by pushing the clamps up, and then from there really just screw everything down and get everything into position. Now I will mention on this real quick, my two outer boards, I use 3 boards of maple, and my 2 outer boards are a little bit less wide than the middle board. So that way, I just did that. I thought that would give me a good even look and keep the width of the board that I wanted to have. But you can choose whatever width you want for your cutting board, whatever you think looks good. So here you can see I've got everything in place and just made sure it was ready to dry. And I did let it sit overnight. I'd be ready to go the next day. So here I definitely cut off the edges there, just use the bandsaw to get everything all square. And for this, I'm definitely not showing as much work as I did. I sanded on this a lot to get it down where it needed to be. The walnut and the maple definitely took a long time to get sanded down to where it was finally even, where you can see it in this shot here. So again, I put the jig back on the cutting board and used the router to cut my next line and just repeated the process. So ran the whole thing through the bandsaw. Trying to keep that bandsaw in the groove as best I can, not hitting the edges to keep that straight line. And then to go back and use a flush trim bit again to be able to trim everything down. Now you can see I do have some burning going on there with that maple, but it's in the middle of the wood, so you'll never see it, so it wasn't that big a deal. And I did go back with a sander just to make sure I cleaned up all the rough edges there for everything. So if you have a router stand, that'll make this a lot easier, but I didn't, so I just put it on the edge and went for it there. So at this point I'm cutting these strips for the next inlay there. Make sure I've got everything ready, and then we'll repeat that process again just by gluing everything up. So again, I put everything into clamps, and then when it was dry the next day, cut the edges off and then sanded it down. And actually on this step, I did have to go back with a planer, and again, this isn't all the work, but just a couple shots there to get it down to where it was close enough to be able to sand it. Now for here, I wanted to give that kind of nice rounded edge, again like David did. I just thought it looked really well. So first I found the center point, and then marked down the sides where it would be even, and I used a strip to bend it there to actually draw that line to get that nice curved shape on there. After that was done, I went and ran this through the bandsaw to get as close to my line as I could, and trimmed it down on both sides. But then once I had it as close to the line as I could with the bandsaw, I then took it over to my sander and actually sanded it down right to the line to get it all nice and even. And it does turn out looking a lot better than just a square rectangular, straight edge cutting board. That rounded edge, it definitely adds a lot to the cutting board. Now once that was done, I went back with a round over bit. I believe David did a chamfer, but I decided to use a round over bit on mine, and I rounded off all the long edges and then went back with a sander when that was all done to kind of finish making sure everything was nice and soft for the hands, and on the corners too, just rounded those over. So this maple sanded down really smooth, and it was awesome. I used a 220 grit, was the last grit that I used on here, and it just made the maple really just feel like glass. It did a really great job, and I'm definitely really pleased with that final turnout on the sanding and all the edges. It just was great and looks and feels awesome. Now before putting feet on here, I did go back with mineral oil and coated the whole thing, and I'll probably coat it one more time before I give it away as a present to the people I'm giving it to. But I did coat the front and the back with mineral oil just because it's a cutting board, and that's what we want to use to maintain it through the whole life of the cutting board. Actually, you want to maintain that with mineral oil. So once that was done, I give it a day or two just to kind of dry. I found these feet. You can buy these online. These are actually, I think, cabinet bumpers is what they call them, but they're self-adhesive. So put them down, drill some pilot holes, and then screw them in using stainless steel screws. Again, that was recommended by David since these will be getting wet to make sure they don't rust into the board. Now once you've got that done, that gives you your completed cutting board, and I'm super excited. I think it's going to look great. It does look great. I'm excited to give it away.
Alright, so here you have it. This is our completed cutting board. I hope this inspires you for your next project and gives you something awesome to build next time you're out in your shop. So until next time, be safe, keep learning, keep building.